Welcome to Church Without Walls. Today we're going to talk about how a Christian polling agency, Barna Research, just came out with an article that says 1 in 5 churches is going to be closing within the next 18 months because of the pandemic crisis. So today we're going to look at that and we're going to see it as something positive. What possibly could be good news out of that story? Next on Church Without Walls. So, the article shared by Michael Grabowski is quoting David Kinnaman from the Barna Research Group. And it says, as many as 1 in 5 churches can permanently close as a result of shutdowns stemming from the coronavirus epidemic. According to David Kinnaman, president of the prominent Christian research organization, Barna Group. In an interview with NPR Monday regarding the status of American churches after months of shutdowns, Kinnaman said although churches were handling things pretty swimmingly at first, he must be a Brit, circumstances have changed for some. Swimmingly. Interesting. He noted that although many churches have opened as states' shutdown orders are loosened, their service have had a lot less people coming. They're recognizing that the relationships that they thought were much deeper with people were actually not as deep as they expected, Kinnaman told NPR. He then explained that in keeping with research from earlier this year, he still expected to see about 1 in 5 churches permanently close within the next 18 months. If anything, he said, I think that prediction was based on data about 2.5 months ago, and I think we're even more likely to see that to be the case today, he noted. The disruptions related to giving, and maybe even as important to all that, is that even for those churches that have reopened, they're seeing much smaller numbers of people show up. So simply reopening the church doesn't fix the underlying economic challenges that you might have. Now, if an atheist reads that argument, especially if he's an hostile atheist, he might think this is good news. So what am I saying by kind of agreeing with atheists that 1 in 5 churches closing down might be a blessing in disguise? Well, I'm going to share something that Dr. Richard C. Halverson once said. He was, of course, an epic, a very famous chaplain of the U.S. Senate, as chaplains of the U.S. Senate goes. They're not household names, but Richard C. Halverson held the respect and the admiration of a wide swath of fellow Americans, people in the clergy and out of the clergy. Halverson, who was born in 1916, passed in 95, said the following. He said, in the beginning, the church was a fellowship of men and women centering on the living Christ. Then the church moved to Greece, where it became a philosophy. Then it moved to Rome, where it became an institution. Next, it moved to Europe, where it became a culture. And finally, it moved to America, where it became an enterprise. And by the word enterprise, he means a conglomeration of business, a Fortune 500. Each of those comments, by the way, I hate to say it, rings true. Now, when I shared this earlier on Facebook, I got some interesting reactions. I think the sincere Christian reaction to a lot of this, especially a quote like that, whenever they hear something negative about the church or Christianity, they get reflexive and defensive, and they put up their dukes, because it's got to be a godly atheist who's picking on the church, damn it, and I'm going to get in between her and this crass worldly voice, and I'm going to punch him in the nose, right? And it's an admirable reaction, I guess, if not a bit naive. But the most strident critics of the church over the ages have not been people outside the church. They have not been angry voices that don't even believe in God. They've been the voice of God himself. If you read the Old Testament with even one eye open, you'll see major criticisms coming to the church, or Israel as it was known at the time, from God. The New Testament is no different. If you simply survey the words of the Apostle Paul, he wrote, 10 letters to 8 churches, something like that, and Jesus wrote 7 to 7 in Revelation. If you read those letters, you find a continuum of praise and rebuke. And some of the harshest rebuke comes from those who love the church the best, the bridegroom and the apostle. And so you have very strong language. By the way, it eclipses anything Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens might say. The wounds of a lover, right? The wounds of a lover. And so when I posted this by Halverson, I got some brief responses, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, but there will always be a remnant, that's going to be faithful. And sure, sin abounds, but there'll always be a remnant. Yeah, you get this reflexive defensive action, right? And instead of just realizing that there's truth here, there's truth in what Halverson says about the outside cultures that adopted Christianity actually saw the Christianity adopting their outside cultures. In other words, the bride of Christ is flexible, and she's sometimes a schizophrenic wretch. And Paul tells us this is going to happen. In Ephesians 5, you have a picture of a wedding between the bridegroom, Christ, and his bride, the church, the outcalled, those who trust and follow Christ, as a metaphor. But it isn't a picture of an American wedding where the bride never looks more beautiful in her stunning white dress as she walks down the aisle escorted by a regal father, at the arm and received. The bride is really the focal point of any wedding in our day and in our culture. But in Ephesians 5, she's my fair lady. She's a tramp on the street that's found by a prince, and she's transformed in the relationship to this prince. I mean, he washes the street dirt off of her, and I'm sorry, but it is like a My Fair Lady. You might find it sexist, but it's a metaphor. And so we're going through a transformation. We're not infallible. Jesus Christ is infallible. And although it's Jesus Christ who said the gates of hell shall not prevail, right? In this relationship, the church is opposed to the gates of hell, the authority of hell, the strength of hell. Well, hell might not prevail. What do we say when the pandemic is? If this pandemic, really what it's going to be is a speed bump in American history, is strong enough to close down 1 out of 5 churches, what does that mean? Well, Halverson said the church has become a business. So doesn't that follow? In other words, how many restaurants are going to close down because of the pandemic? Restaurants are a business. They're a service business. They depend on people coming and giving their money. Churches depend on people coming and giving their money. How many restaurants are going to close? Have closed already, will never open again. How many theaters? Is the theater industry even going to make it through this? Or are movies in the future going to go direct to, on demand? So when the church becomes a business and that church dies because it's a business, should we mourn its death? After all, what does Christ tell us about the church? So I think what we're seeing is a fundamental transformation of what we call church, and I think it's a good thing, and I'm going to tell you why right now. When Halverson alludes to the early church in that statement, in the beginning the church was a fellowship of men and women centering around the living Christ, this is exactly true. And we didn't have big buildings, we didn't have multi-million-dollar budgets, we didn't have 30 pastors on staff. The church in America is so different from the early church, it wouldn't be recognizable if the Apostle Paul or somebody was transported from the first century to ours. We would look more like the Temple of Diana to him than what the church was in Lydia's living room. Now, having said that, I'm not just here to critique the American church. I actually had this realization after 20 years of being a pastor of a typical church myself, and I realized that we've gotten away from the fellowship of men and women centering on the living Christ. And you know where they did this? Around a dinner table. And everything would be simpler if it went back to home churches, house churches, without pastors' salaries, with all the money that's collected, not out of guilt, but out of a love offering being given to the poor. What if our churches took on that nature? This is something that Church Without Walls has been saying since the inception of this ministry, that we should go back to the home church. Pastors should have no problem working during the week, making tents, so as not to put a strain on the fellowship. And the fellowship, if it did collect money, it should be to the relief of those in need, and 100% should go to it. Recently, I should show you this actually. This is unbelievable. Let me open this up, but let me continue to talk about it. If you think I'm picking on the church, folks, please read what Jesus wrote about the churches in Revelation 2 and 3. I'm not going to talk about spewing anyone out or anything like that, but here it is, 50 largest denominations. I'm going to put this into the program so you can see it, hopefully so you can see it and see the kind of money we're talking about here. So, what was I going to tell you? I've lost my train of thought, but I'm going to go to this right now. So I'm cutting to a story here. The 50 largest evangelism and discipleship ministries in the U.S. And, I would like to make this larger so you could see it better, but I'm not sure if I can do that from here. So just try and follow along for a second. And the largest organization is CRU, or Campus Crusade for Christ, which is an evangelism mission on college campuses. They only get a 3-star efficiency rating, which means, are they transparent in how in other words, they're getting a C from this Ministry Watch, which looks at how donations are given to Christian ministries and how transparent they are with what happens with the money and where it goes and how much of the money goes to an actual ministry. $624 million this organization takes in, and they get a C grade. Young Life is another ministry to young people. It takes in $426 million. Now they get an A grade, but they're still only a 3-star efficiency rating. They're not a 5-star. You don't get to a 5-star until you get to Every Home for Christ, down at number 9, $56 million, but they still get a C on transparency. Wycliffe Associates gets a D. Johnny and Friends gets 3 stars, but gets an A, $44 million. Look at this money here. Answers in Genesis. I'm sorry, but Ken Ham, $35 million. 2 stars and an A, which is kind of a cognitive dissonance. How tragic this is. How utterly tragic that these so-called ministries, and I say so-called in some areas because if you look at what money was used for in the New Testament, it was used in a very different way, actually to actually go to the needy. And some of the greatest strides in Christianity have been exactly this: Christian people giving themselves to those in need, those who are hurting, those who are struggling, leprosy communities, or communities that are starving or don't have fresh water. Now, I know some of the ministries on that list tend to these things, so I'm not grouping them all together. But it's a stunning amount of money that are pouring into these ministries and fellowships, and they're getting a lesser grade than Fortune 500 businesses get. And they might even be behind bars if they weren't 501c3s by the way they handle their money and transparencies. And yet Christians keep going through this cycle in America because church has become a business. And we're so used to going on Sunday morning, sitting for, 40 minutes and getting three, as my father used to say, 3 points of poem and a prayer, and giving our tithing envelope or whatever. And we become disconnected from the community around us. And the church has not brought honor to the Lord's name in America. It's brought shame to the Lord's name in America. And how do I know this? If you look at any poll and you ask people outside of the church what they think of the church, they think less of that beautiful bride in the white dress and more of that foul, cursing girl selling flowers on the London street. In other words, the American church is looked at as judgmental, as hypocritical, as shady, as sinister, all kinds of things, but it's not looked at as a group of people who, at the forefront of their motivation, is love. The early church was. Even though the early church was hated and was blamed for things, even the enemies of the early church would say things like, it's utterly amazing at the love they had one for another, or Christians are despicable atheists because they didn't worship the emperor. They were called atheists because they wouldn't kiss Nero's statue. But it was said, but their yea was yea, their yes was yes, and their no was no, and they honor what their word is, which was so outlandish in Roman culture of the first century. They stood out, I'm afraid, like the Amish would stand out to us today, and not because they were weird or dressed weird or were backward or wouldn't use modern, but they were just so different from the culture of its day. Halverson's quote suggests that culture in times of weakness for the church has influenced the church more than the church has influenced culture. And he's right. Some of our doctrines we carry today came from the early Greek converts of the church. You don't see it in the first 300 years. You don't see eternal conscious torment. You don't see penal substitutionary atonement in the first 300 years of church history. Or if you do, it's a speck. It's not common conversation. You have to really dig for it. This all came out of Augustine and forward. And so Greek converts came into the church bringing its ideas of, Platonic ideas of heaven and hell. And we've adopted this. And to this day, we carry the baggage of Greek culture. To this day, we carry the baggage of Roman culture, of European culture, and finally of American culture, which, if you're not attuned to that, the world has caught up to us in the way we produce, in the industry-like nature of American culture, in the kind of, how would you say it, the kind of mass-produced factory assembly line which we developed before anyone else did. As a matter of fact, as late as World War II, Hitler was mocking the United States, and when threatened with us entering into the war, Hitler said, Americans don't know how to do anything except to make movies and to make cars. Well, he'd eat those words because the car industry basically won the war. When FDR went to Knudsen and others and said, I need help, we're way behind for the war machine, and we've got to start building planes. And at one point, FDR said, we're going to build, 25,000 planes a month. And Hitler laughed. He said, that'll never happen. And we far exceeded what FDR predicted, because once the machine got rolling, and that machine, by the way, was Detroit. Detroit won World War II, if you look at it. We just many times outproduced the rest of the world. But the bad thing about it is, when it comes to the church, that kind of efficiency, that kind of business-like nature kills the spirit of a church that was built around fellowship at a dinner table. Now, I want to suggest a few things to you. I want to plant seeds this week, and I want you to let it germinate in your thinking over the next few weeks. How can this be a good thing that some 75,000 churches are going to die on the vine because of the pandemic? I'd say these churches, a friend of mine, by the way, who happens to be a pastor, I'm going to just read to you what he said in response. Oh, let's check Payton Cam. I'm going to go to Payton Cam as I look for Pastor Reverend Jeff's response. So we're going to check in on Payton Cam, and I'm going to look for Pastor Jeff's response because it was really relevant. Okay, here it is. So, all right, Payton Cam, it looks like a lion or a sphinx. No, it's a snake. It's a cobra. Cobra Kai.
I'm really tempted to draw a big pink bow on top of its head, but I won't.
A pink bow on top of a Cobra Kai symbol? Are you kidding me? That's sacrilege. We'll come back to that. Where were we? Reverend Jeff. So Jeff response to the article I shared, the 1 in 5. Now Jeff is a pastor of an assembly in Elgin, Illinois, or is he in Elgin now? I think he just moved, so I'm sorry, Jeff. But Jeff says he's not surprised at all by this. The church, as it is the body of Christ in the world, will transfigure to new life. But the church, as a human institution, will eventually die off. Although there will be resurrection to something new, we don't like to hear that, as what we know as church is a comfort to us, but it is the truth. The church was constricting already before the pandemic. So that is the truth, and that's something many of us recognize, that the church was going through this transformation. It was dying. Young people were fleeing the church, and many assemblies are just filled with older people who are going through the motions. The church has become a social club. It has become the Moose Lodge. I used to say to Wendy, I said, even unfortunately about churches we knew, I said to Wendy, I said, the church is a Moose Lodge. And when we built the church in Bensonville, just down the street from us was a Moose Lodge. And so I say that because you'd see a few cars there on the weekend. Some of the old schoolers who would still show up for a game of chess and, share some gossip and talk about what their sons are doing in other states or whatever. And it was their social engagement for the week, and they'd get together. And that Moose Lodge, eventually you'd see the weeds grow up around it, and eventually it closed down. Right? These guys died off, and their sons didn't join, and the families didn't continue the tradition. It was a dying tradition, and the Moose Lodge is no longer there. I think the building's been torn down, and many churches are going through the same thing. And it's a good thing. It's the pruning of the real church. It's the pruning of the tree that's going to remove some of the things that have come in through culture that aren't necessarily life-giving or health-giving or even attractive to those outside the church. These are things that are quite often off-putting to those who are on outside of it, those who we are trying to minister to or attract. Now, let me just point out a few things to you in suggestions of how the baggage that we've carried, from Rome, from Greece, from Rome, from Europe, and from the American. We keep throwing things into the salad, right? And mixing it up, hoping that adding more ingredients will give it the relevance it once had, as it did in the first century, and it's just making things worse. I mean, but let me just suggest a few things. A lot of the questions we have in modern times would never have been asked in the time of the Apostle Paul. In the church in Corinth, for example, we get questions today like, is your church LGBTQ affirming? In other words, do you allow homosexuals to come to your church? Do you allow them to sing in your choir? Think about how crazy these questions are if you put them in the terms of meeting in Lydia's living room. If you understand what hospitality was in the first century, Lydia didn't have a bodyguard saying you can't come in. The early church welcomed all. Come as you are. You're interested in Christ? You want to hear about Christ? You want to sing praise to Christ? Come on in. Here's some bread and wine. Let's do this. So now they might be in that living room and they might hear things that made them uncomfortable, because that's what the Word does when it transforms you. And I'm speaking of Christ, the Word. I'm living up to a divine nature oftentimes is uncomfortable for all of us. So I'm not saying it was all, what's that called, Payton? Cotton candy? I'm not saying it was just all, cotton candy and easy to digest. Following Christ means something, right? It means you're going to die to yourself. And some of those things that those early believers had to die to are things mentioned in the New Testament. And some of them were dearly held and deeply held because it was cultural. And they brought in their cultural, sometimes biases and sometimes predilections and sometimes pleasures. And they were challenged by their new relationship. Is this really in line with what Christ taught? And so I'm not saying it was easy, but I'm saying it welcomed all. There wasn't a litmus test. There weren't bouncers at the door saying, "Oh, well, you can't come in dressed like that." That wouldn't even be a question. Oh, he can sing, he can't sing. That's a legitimate question in churches today. Oh, so and so is gay. We can't. I mean, they could come to the church. We love them enough to let them sit in the pew. But certainly they can't serve coffee, or they can't be seen serving in the church because it could look like an endorsement of their lifestyle. All these crazy questions that divide the body have come in because we've changed the nature of what church means. We've changed the nature of people sitting around a table enjoying a meal, saying what they've gotten in their relationship from the Lord and being taught. The word disciple has been Christianized and ruined. When the New Testament used the word disciple, it used it in the Greek way. I'm sorry, but that's one thing from the culture that we don't have to apologize for. The Greek way, Payton camp. Ooh, it's getting nicer, a little more color in there. The Greek way of discipleship, that understanding was that there were many schools of teachers. There were different teachers, and this was no different in the Jewish world. There were rabbis that were well known for their teachings, and their teachings weren't the same. Their teachings differed. And so oftentimes they'd publicly be rivals. And so you had the choice between Miyagi-Do dojo or Cobra Kai. Cobra Kai never dies. And you could choose. Oh, I'm going to follow Cobra Kai because I think Johnny Lawrence makes more sense than Danielson. You could choose, and you'd follow. And sometimes you'd be disillusioned. You'd follow for a time and say, "Oh, this isn't for me." And you'd switch from Cobra Kai to Miyagi-Do, right? And vice versa. And this was true of the Greek teachers, right? Aristotle grew up under Plato, and they had differences. And Aristotle started his own school. Alexander attended or was tutored by Aristotle. Diogenes, one of my favorites, the cynic, the dog, had a very different teaching. And if I was going to be a disciple of the dog, right, I'd have to, be enamored by the teachings of the cynics, right? The Stoics had their teachers. Jesus Christ was a teacher. And to be a disciple of Jesus Christ meant you followed him because you found health and life and prudence in his teaching. And you felt it was worthy following. And following him wasn't just a mental assent. It wasn't just, dude, my stream is breaking up. That's not good pay. My stream just went to orange instead of red, so I don't think we're on Facebook anymore because I forgot to do the plug.
You want to go grab the plug right now?
Yeah. I'm going to go to Payton Cam. Can you talk a little bit?
Sure.
About what you're drawing, and I'll grab the plug.
So this is a snake. It might be a cobra. I didn't have a reference picture, so we kind of just drew a snake. And that's a flower, kind of a garden area. And I was about to draw a big, beautiful butterfly when Dad realized the stream wasn't working. So I'll draw a butterfly with you guys right now. So first I'll do the middle part, the body. Do the little antennas. And now I'll grab a different color for the wings. What about this color and this color? And this color. Those are very pretty colors.
else there, Pay?
So you draw an outline, and then I'm teaching them how to draw a butterfly, Dad.
Okay.
And
So you're like Bob Ross?
You make some circles, or whatever pattern you want. I like to make circles. Sometimes their wings aren't even, but that's okay. And then you could draw different kind of shape of circles, or stripes, or spots, whatever.
So I'm back. I'm not sure if our stream is back. Mom says we're freezing. I'm going to start and stop the streaming. So I'm going to come back on the stream, and people will have to see two items. But we're still recording, so let me come back and we'll finish up. It says the streaming is stopping, but it's taking forever. Okay, there we go. So now I think we're starting to stream again. I'm not sure if it's going. I think we're back. I think we're back on Facebook Live. Folks, we got cut off. I forgot to plug in the cord, so we were on wireless and it was choppy, but we're back, and I'm sorry if we got separated. Do you remember what I was talking about? Oh, discipleship. So Jews would follow a rabbi. I got to close that. Now we're off stream again. I got to start again, Pay.
Do I need to talk more?
No, I think it's coming. Okay, it turned red.
Okay.
If it doesn't work this time, folks, we're just going to record it and upload it later. But apparently we're back on Facebook Live for the moment. We're talking about discipleship. And the Barna study that showed 1 in 5 churches is going to close within the next 18 months, and how that could be a positive thing as we get back to maybe the root of Christianity and the central focus of Christianity. Oh, we're going to go off again, Pay. I'm just going to turn it off and finish up.
Okay.
All right, because it's not working. All right. So, discipleship. You were enamored by a teaching or a teacher, and you follow, and you try to live up to the precepts that teacher taught. That's the fundamental understanding of discipleship. We've Christianized it, and it's sucked meaning out of it and changed it and deformed it. But when the New Testament writers talked about discipleship, they were using a word that was common to a Greek or a Roman and a Jew, to the whole culture of their day, because Jews would follow preferred rabbis, and there were Greek schools of thought. Even so much so that when Paul goes to Mars Hill in Athens, when he goes to the Areopagus, it was because the Epicureans were there and the Stoics were there. So those are two factions of Greek philosophy with some overlap, but they were there presenting their schools of thought. And all of a sudden, here comes this rabbling Jew, right? And to talk about the God, the unknown God. And so this is what discipleship meant. And so imagine all this baggage that goes out the window if we get back to the dinner table and we say that Christian fellowship in the living room means we invite our neighbors, come as you are. It doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is. It doesn't matter if you're going to vote or not vote for Donald Trump. It doesn't matter what your economic class is, right? And Paul said over and over the antithesis of the Pharisaical prayer, which he used to pray as a Pharisee. God, I thank you that I'm not a woman, that I'm not a slave, right? And that I'm not a barbarian. That was thrown on its head when he was confronted by the person of Christ, and he became a disciple of Christ. And now he says that the body of Christ, the true church, is not categorized by male or female. It's not segregated by free or slave, or by Jew or non-Jew, Jew or Gentile, Goyim. These things don't even enter into the mix. Now, if they still do in your church today, if women can't speak in your church, that's baggage from American culture. That's baggage from American culture. That's not true Christianity. Jesus broke the molds. He broke the chains. And Paul continued that process. And it should continue in every generation, because the transformation and the reformation of the age isn't so that we could go back and live like the first century disciples, because they had boundaries that they were trying to break down. We should live as Christ followers in the 21st century, which means something very different than in the first century. And if it hasn't, then we've missed the point of what Paul and Christ were teaching. The ideal is set forth in what Paul says, that male and female don't matter in the body of Christ. Well, if it does in your Baptist church, you have a problem, and you're not following Christ. That black or white, that rich or poor, that free or slave, that Republican or Democrat, right? That American or Canadian. None of these things are distinctions. They might be distinctions elsewhere in your living, but not at the family table. So what would America look like if, instead of giving millions and millions of dollars to these mission groups that get a C with what they do with their money, if we actually met with pastors who worked for a living at their dinner table, or maybe it's a fellowship of Christians that don't have a pastor, that simply come together and break bread together and have wine or have a meal together, and they celebrate the person of Christ. And maybe different people bring that celebration every week, and we sing together, not knowing or caring what your preference is for a boyfriend or a girlfriend. But we want to follow Jesus. And if you want to follow Jesus and praise Jesus, come as you are. How different would the church be if it was centered again around the hospitality of a living room and a dining room table? How different we'd appear in the eyes of the world, who have rejected us already, as hypocritical, as judgmental, as too much like a business. All this talk about organized religion. Do you think it happened in the first century? Oh, no, I don't want to meet in the catacombs, the organized religion, you think there were arguments about tithing? I just think it's absurd what we've accepted as in modern times for the church. And if we look back to when the church had it right, and to when the church made a difference, and to when the church really had a strength to transform culture and wasn't transformed by culture, then we can take those principles and adopt them for our time period and really bring glory to God, and really get out of the way and quit obstructing the view of a world that needs to see our Christ. And that's all I have to say for you today. It looks like Peyton's yawning and groaning and rolling her eyes, and it looks like she's ready.
I didn't sleep last night.
You didn't sleep last night. Well, why don't you tell us about your picture? Let's cut to Peyton Camp.
So remember when I was teaching him how to draw the butterfly? That's the butterfly.
But you're upside down right now.
And then here's some birds. And then this is the sun and the flower image. I added some more petals. And then there's a grassy area, the garden by the flower. And then this is my cobra.
Cobra Kai.
Cobra Kai never dies.
Yeah. Well, folks, if you haven't seen Cobra Kai, which is the continuing story of Johnny Lawrence from Cobra Kai and Danielson from Miyagi Karate, it's well worth your time. I love what they're doing with it. It's not as black and white as the original movie was. They're showing it's really a story of redemption. And not only do Americans love a story of redemption, all human beings love a story of redemption. And this is why the Christ story is appealing to us. And so Johnny and his son, who come from a place of rebellion, are actually being transformed. And it's wonderful to watch, and you even find yourself cheering for Johnny. I don't want to give you any spoilers, But Peyton and I are really enjoying the 2 seasons of Cobra Kai that just landed on Netflix. So that's our recommendation for you this week, is study the first century church, ask how church can be more relevant in our culture today, and maybe ask what baggage we've brought in and we haven't noticed. You know how you live in a house for 20 years and you accumulate a bunch of junk? When you move, you notice it all. And you look at something you find in your garage. Why did I store this for 6 years? Why did I hold on to this? Look at all this clutter. How did we accumulate all this over the years? And you have to order a dumpster before you move to Arizona. And you have to fill a dumpster with a bunch of junk, or donate or sell it, because it's no longer relevant. And to be honest with you, it probably never was. This is what the church in America looks like today. You know, a Japanese politician once said of the Americans that we're fat, lazy, and stupid. And I think that might have been a snapshot of the ugly American in his mind. I don't believe that. I think American ingenuity is amazing. But I do think that there's some truth in that criticism when it comes to the American church. When we look at the American church, after all, Dietrich Bonhoeffer came here, and even in the 20s, the late 20s, when Bonhoeffer came here in the early 30s, he noticed just how much fluff there was in the evangelical church at the time of the 30s. So look, if we don't have room for criticism, we're not true Christ followers. We're not true disciples, because the New Testament is filled with criticism of the church. God wants his son to grow up, so he disciplines him. And the bride of Christ isn't beautiful on day one. He finds us in the street of London selling flowers, cursing like a sailor. And so we are going through a transformation. It's okay. And we're going through growing pains. It's okay. So don't mourn the loss of these 1 in 5 churches that are going to close. Take it up as a banner to improve, that this gleaning will yield to more fruit. They used to write Ichabod on churches that closed. My brother related this to me earlier. You'll find it in the Bible, by the way. Ichabod means the Spirit has left. And the truth is, this pandemic might be the splitting of the curtain at the Holy of Holies, and it might reveal that there's no furniture in there. It might be the pulling back of the drape in the Emerald City, and we find out that booming voice that we thought was a deity is just a little man with a pretty awesome what is it called? Microphone. That's all I got. Say goodbye, Pay. We love you.
I got
Thanks
my
for
nails
listening.
done.
Peyton got her nails done. Her mom did her nails. You got your hair done, too, this week.
Yeah, I got my hair done.
Very pretty.
Got everything done.
You got everything done. It's nice. It's nice to be a 10-year-old without a mortgage and responsibility. All right, we'll see you, folks. Thanks for joining us. Put this up in a moment. Oh,